Hello guys, and welcome back to my video. So in this video we are going to continue with our job board application series using Flutter, and we also created this application using Node.js Express.js and MongoDB. So if you have not watched the backend series part, you can go onto my YouTube channel and you can watch this playlist right here. It has all the details, all the tutorial from building a Node.js application from scratch up to deployment to AWS. Right. So without wasting much of the time, let's dive deep into today's episode. Right. So today we are going to be retrieving our vacancies from our backend. Right. We are going to be displaying these vacancies onto our backend. Right. So now, without wasting much of the time, let's go inside our application. And then inside our application, let's go to our application folder. Right. And then let's create another inside the features folder. Let's create another folder called vacancies. So inside this folder, we also need a subfolder, which is going to be a repository. And then we also need a controllers folder, a controller. And then we also need a widgets folder. And then we also need a screen folder, right? Okay, now that we are done, let's go inside our repository and then let's create a file that we're going to call vacancy repository.dat. Okay, so now inside this file, let's create a class called vacancy repository, right? So let's create a class called vacancy repository. So this class is going to have it's going to have a variable that we are going to define, which is going to be http.client, right? And then after this, let's just create a vacancy constructor, and then let's bind our vacancy inside this constructor, right? And then let's set our client variable to the one that we have created, right. So now after this, what we need to do is we need to import the client, right? So we need to import the client, right? The HTTP client, right? So now that we are done, the first thing that we need to do is we need to get all the job vacancies, right? So what I would do is if I pull out Postman, right? So I'll simply pull out a Postman, and then if we go to job board, we have these vacancies right here, right? Get vacancies method that will allow us to get all the vacancies. So what I'm simply going to do here is I'm simply going to send a get request, right? So now, as you can see, we get all these vacancies, right? We get all these vacancies, but we can also, if we go to our params, right, we need to define. If we go to our params, right, we can define the page and then the limit, right? So let's say page 1, we define page 1, and then let's say limit, let's say we are going to limit to just 5 vacancies, but in our application, we are going to limit to like 10 vacancies, right? As you can see now, we are only getting like 5 vacancies from our, application. So this is pagination, right? So we are going to implement the same inside our Flutter application. So let's go inside our Flutter application and then let's start implementing, right? So since we are getting the vacancies from an API, we are going to use a future method, right? So if you don't know what basically a future method is a method that we use when we don't know when we are guaranteed to get a result, right? In this case, we are getting vacancies from an API, but we don't know when those vacancies are going to be returned, right? So we are going to await the vacancies. We are going to wait for the future vacancies. So that's why we use the future method, right? And then we are going to define an either, right? And then we'll use this either to handle API errors, right? And then we'll also get like a list of vacancies, right? So we're going to call it a vacancy, right? So what basically this either method is I'm just going to simply import it, and then from fp.package, as you can see, it's a sealed class where we have like a left and a right, and then we are going to use the left side to represent errors. That is, if we get from an API, if we are getting an error, we're going to represent with the left side. If we are going to get a success, we are going to represent it with the right side. In this case, if we get a success, it's going to be what? A list of vacancies, right? Which is the vacancy model, which we are just going to create in a moment, right? And then the method is going to be get vacancies, right? And then we are going to define, the method is going to have like parameters. So we are going to have like the page, which is the page for our vacancies, and then the limit, right? And then the limit of the vacancies that we are going to get from our backend, right? And then it's going to be an async function, right? So it's going to be an async function. As you can see, we haven't defined the vacancy model yet. So now let's go inside our vacancies folder. Let's create another subfolder that we forgot to create, which is going to be the model. So the model of vacancies. So what I'm basically going to do is I'm going to go inside the category model, and then I'm simply going to copy. I'm simply going to copy this or this code right here, and then I'm going to inside our model folder, and then let's create a file called vacancy model. Okay, so now what I'm just going to do, I'm simply going to just refactor this code here. So just make sure this part match your file name, right? If you don't, you are going to get an error. And then let's change this to vacancy model. And then simply going to change this to vacancies from JSON, right? And then also let's change refactor code to vacancy. And then let's also refactor this from vacancy model. Then it's going to be vacancy model JSON. So we don't need this extension since we don't have any images coming from the vacancies, right? So if we go back to our Postman, let's go back to our Postman, and then you can see this JSON object that we have for vacancies. We have the title, description, requirements, skills, salary, and then we also have categories, and then company also. Okay, so now let's go back and start refactoring our the fields inside the vacancy model, right? So basically what I'm simply going to do here, we have the title, and then I'm going to change this to description, and then we also have the vacancy ID. So let's go back to our Postman. Let's check if we have like vacancy ID. Yes, we also have vacancy ID, right? So now we also have requirements. And then we have a list of skill checks, right? Which is going to be a list of strings, right? And then we'll also have the experience. And then we also have salary. It's going to be a string, and then we also have benefits, which is going to be a string also. And then we also have a company, which is going to be an object. Company, which is going to be another separate class model. And then we also have, yeah, so that's it basically. So now what we simply have to do here is, let's go inside our features folder, right? Let's create another folder called company. And then inside that folder, let's create another folder inside the subfolder called model, right? So the model folder, let's create, it's going to be company model. Company model.dat, right? So let's just copy this and then let's just change it to company model. Okay, so let's get rid of this. We don't need to retrieve a list of companies. No, we don't need that. So now let's just refactor this to company. Let's also change this to company model, right? And then company model. And then also let's get rid of this. We don't need this extension. I think we need it because we are going to have a company logo. Okay, now what we simply have to do now is let's change the fields inside the company. So let's get rid of this. I don't think we need it. So we have string the company ID, and then we have the company name, and then we also have company address. And then we have the company logo. And then also company phone number. Then maybe if the company has a site link, yeah, we also need that. And then company email. All right, so now that we are done with this, so we now have these classes. So now what we can simply do is we can simply generate them using phrase classes using a dot run command, right? So here, this is the command, the dot run build runner build delete conflicting outputs, right? Let's So as you can see, now we have generated the company model. It is now we now have the company model first, company model.g.dat. But here we still have some errors because we need to import the company model class. So let's import it here. Okay, so this is supposed to be company model. This is supposed to be vacancy model from JSON. Okay, so now let's run our dat run build runner command again. Now, as you can see, we have now generated the model for vacancies, right? So now let's go back to our vacancy repository. So basically what we are simply going to do is I'm going to import the vacancy model here. And then now what we simply have to do now is we need to start building our application, right? So the first thing that we need to do is we need to create request headers, right? So it's going to be a map of type string and then of type string again, right? And then we're simply going to name it request headers. So we want to accept anything that is application /JSON, right? So we're telling our backend to just accept anything that is application.json, and then also want the content type to be application /JSON, right? And then now we need to define the URL, which is going to be URI.http. And then first we need to define the base URL, right? So first thing we need to define the base URL. And then the second thing we need to define what our route, right? In this case, our route is going to be what? Vacancies URL, right? And then after this, what we need to do is we need to define parameters, right? Request parameters, right? In this case, since we are applying pagination, because what we want to do is, for example, if we have like thousands of job vacancies from our backend, we don't want to load those vacancies at once, right? Firstly, it's going to overwhelm the user's UI, and secondly, it's going to consume the user's data, right? So we want to load our data in parts, right, which you call pagination, right? So the first parameter that we need to define is the page, right? So we want to define the page, which is going to be page.toString, right? We are going to convert to a string. And then the second one is the limit, right? So per page, how many items do we want to limit, right? So which is going to be the limit to string, right? So those are the parameters that we want to append on our URL, right? And then now what we need to do is we need to get a response, right, from our backend, right? So to get a response, what we simply have to do is we simply have to await the response, and then we use the HTTP client to get that response. So now we need to define the URL where we need to get the response, and then we'll also define the request headers, right? And then after that, now we need to get our data from our response. So to get our data, we have to decode it, right? We use the JSON decode method to decode it, which we are going to decode from the response.body, right? And then now that we are done with this, now we need to create a try catch block, right? So let's create a try catch block, right? And then we also need to catch the errors if our request is not successful. So now if there's an error, what we simply have to do is we have to return left, if you still remember. Then with app failure, with the app failure that we created, and then the message is going to be e.message, right? it's going to be e.toString. So we simply have to convert it to a string, right? So inside our try catch block now, what you simply have to do is we need to check if our response from the backend, right? Let's say the response from the backend, the response status code is equal to 200. So if our response is equal to 200, that means that our response to the backend was successful. So if the response is successful, what we need to do, we just need to return right, and then with right, then we now return the vacancies that we got from JSON, and then inside here we just simply have to define the data and then the vacancies. So if we go back to our Postman, let me open Postman again and let me show you something. So as you can see, from our vacancies, we have this vacancies object, which has a list of JSON objects, right? So that's why from our data we are calling this vacancies, because it's a list of what? It's a list of our vacancy JSON objects, right? And then else, that means that the response was not successful. So if the response was not successful, we are simply going to return what? We're simply going to return left, and then up failure, and then the message is going to be data, then what? The message that we are going to get from our backend, right? So here we simply have to return, right? So that's it when we on getting all the vacancies from our JSON. As you can see, when dealing with errors, we use the left. As you can see, we used either. So either is just a sealed class that has two outcomes. It has the left and then the right. We use the right to define errors, and then we use the left to define errors, and then we use the right side to just to return the data from our backend. In this case, it's going to be a list of vacancies. That's why we use the list of vacancy model right there, right? So now let's just get rid of this. So I'm just going to import it again. Right, so import. All right, now the next thing that what we need to do is we also need to get vacancies by category, right? So certain vacancies, they belong to certain categories, right? So we are simply going to get vacancies by their category, right? So what we simply have to do is, if I go back, if I open our backend, right, I'm simply going to open our backend. So this is our backend in Express.js, right? So if I go back, if I go to our vacancies route, right? Let's go to our vacancy route. You can see we have this vacancy by category, right? And then we append the category of the vacancy, right? This allows us to get a vacancy by category, right? So that's what we are simply going to do in our front end. So now let's go back to our Flutter code, and then let's begin writing. All right. So what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to copy all this. It's going to be similar. So I'm simply going to copy this, simply going to copy it. I'm just going to paste it below. And then I'm going to change it to get vacancies by category. And then I'm simply going to remove the parameters, right? Query parameters, right? And then inside our vacancies URL, and then it's going to be So let's just append it using, let's just open quotes and then $sign, and then we're going to use / vacancy by category. For parameters now, I think I'm simply going to change these parameters. Yes, we need to change it. Simply need to change our parameters right here. And then required is going to be string category ID, since we're going to retrieve the vacancies by category ID, right? And then we'll simply append the category ID right there, right? So everything else is similar. So now I think everything else is now okay. Everything else is similar. So yeah, that's it for the method for getting our categories by ID. And then now what we need to do is we also need to create a method for searching for vacancies, right? So let me go back to our postman, right? If we go back to our postman right here, so as you can see, we have vacancies, but if I want, right, I can go, let's go to our body, to our params right here, right? So let's go back to our params right here, and then here we are going to have search for / search, and then query parameter. Our query parameter is going to be a query, and then let's just define the query as Flutter. So if you can see, as you can see now, we're only getting job vacancies where there is Flutter, right? As you can see. So this is like a request for searching for vacancies, right? So we are going to what? We are simply going to work on that. We can even change this to Node.js. Let's just change it to Node.js. As you can see, now we're getting vacancies with Node.js backend developer, something like this, right? So as you can see, this is what a search query parameter, search query, right? So now let's go back to our repository, and then let's simply copy this chunk of code again. Let's copy it, and then I'm simply going to paste it below. Right? And then here I'm simply going to change this to search vacancies, right? And then what we need here is a search query, right? String search, right? So now we need to change this to /. If you remember, we changed this to / search, and then we have to append the query, right, with an exclamation mark, query, which is going to be equal to our search, right? So this is the method for searching for vacancies, right? So this is the method for searching for vacancies right there. And then since we are now done with this method right here for searching for vacancies, right? Now we need another method to get the vacancy by ID in case we want to get a single vacancy. So I'm simply going to copy this again, and then I'm simply going to paste it below. Let's check if this is correct. Yeah, this is actually correct. So I'm simply going to paste it below here. And then now I'm going to change this method to get vacancy by ID. So since we are getting a single vacancy, we are not getting a list of vacancies. Let's change this to just vacancy model, because we need to return a single vacancy, not a list of vacancies, right? And then now what we need to do is let's change this to string vacancy ID. Let's change this to /$ vacancy ID. Right, then we need to change this since it's not a list of vacancies, it's just a vacancy. So what we simply have to do is we need to change vacancy model dot from JSON, and then we pass in our data, which is going to be our data, right? And then which is going to be our data, which is going to be, you can just say response.body. Okay, so since we simply define the response, which is going to be data, let's just data, right, which we are going to pass the data that we are going to get from our response.body right there, right? So now that we are done with getting vacancy by ID, we have now defined all the methods for getting vacancies, right? So the first method is to get all the vacancies, of which we are going to apply pagination, because as you can see, we have the required parameter, which is the page, and also the limit, right? For example, if we are on page 1, we are going to say that on page 1 we are going to have we are just going to retrieve 20 items, right? Which we are going to write logic for, which we are going to use. If we reach those 20 items, we can load more items, right? And then we define the URL, and then to our URL we then added the query parameters, which is the page, which is define the page number, and then also the limit of the page, number of limits. For example, we are going to retrieve maybe 20 items per page, right? And then we are going to get the response from our backend, right? Which we are going to await, and then we are going to use the get method to get our response. And then we attach our URL and then our request headers, right? And then we are going to define our data, which we are going to get which we are going to decode from the response.body, right? And then we are going to check if the response.status code is 200. If the response.status code is 200, we are going to just retrieve a list of vacancies. Otherwise, we are going to just display the error. And then if somehow we got an error, we are just simply catching that error, and then we are going to display it, right? Simply this is the same thing that we are going to do without getting the vacancies by category, right? But we are just going to append the category ID at the end, right? Same with the search. We are simply searching for vacancies, right? We just have to use to attach the query, right? Which is this query right there, and then everything else is just the same. And then we are going to retrieve a single vacancy, for example, a vacancy by ID, right? Which we are going to use the vacancy ID to get a particular vacancy, right? So now that we are done with the vacancy repository, now it's time to move on to the vacancy controller, right? So now moving on to our controller, right? So if we go on to our vacancy folder, inside the vacancy folder, let's create a file called VacancyController, right? Okay, so before we take care of the vacancy controller, we need to go inside our core folder, right? And then let's create another subfolder, which I'm going to just name Pagination State, right? So inside this, we are going to just create a file that we are going to name Pagination State, right? That's going to represent the state of our paginated data, right? Paginated state.dat, right? So we are also going to use Frist to create like the Pagination State class, right? So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to simply paste the imports here, and then make sure that this part, the Pagination State, matches your file name right there, right? So now let's take care of it. First, let's create an annotation, a Frist annotation, right? And then after that, let's create an abstract class. Pagination State, right, of type T, and then with underscore $, pagination state, and then of type T also, right? And then let's create a constructor, right, which is going to be pagination state, right? So inside this constructor, we need to take care of, we need the data that we are going to get from our API. So it's going to be a list of type T, right? So it's going to be a generic list of type T. So that means that if we can use even vacancy model, or even if we want to paginate applications, right? And then the next thing is we need to create a Boolean, right? Which is going to check if we are loading more items from our API, right? And then we need another Boolean to check if our page has more items, right? Which we are going to just name as next, right? And then we need another Boolean check also if or is loading, right? And then we have a string in case we have an error, and then we also have an integer for our current page, right? So that means the page that we are on when getting data, paginated data from our API, right? So let's just say this is going to be equal to underscore pagination state. Okay, right. So now that we are done, now let's run that build run command, right, to just generate the first class. Right, so as you can see, now we have the pagination state.first, right? So now let's go back to our vacancy controller, right? So now let's create a class that we are simply going to name Vacancy Controller. So this is going to just extend our AsyncNotifier, right, from Riverpod, which is a class from Riverpod. So the AsyncNotifier, we just use it to just manage like asynchronous state. That means that state, if we are getting data from our API, we use the AsyncNotifier, right? And then we also need to, we are just going to define the state of our AsyncNotifier using our paginated state, right? And then we are going, it's going to have like a vacancy model. It's going to be of type vacancy model. Okay, right. And then let's make sure that we import Flutter Riverpod. So first, let's import the vacancy model, and then let's import the pagination state, right? And then now let's import Flutter Riverpod, right? Since we are using Riverpod for state management, right? As we know, like when the AsyncNotifier class is called, or when our vacancy controller is called, right, it has a build function that is going to be called first, right? So the build function is the first function that is going to be called, right? So now let's make sure that we override. It's supposed to be, we need to override this function, right? And then let's just get rid of this, and then it's going to be a future. It's going to be a future or which is going to be of type pagination state. Pagination state, and then vacancy model. And then now, before we even, let's make sure that we just import that async, right? And then before we go on, we need to make sure that we create a couple of variables, right? So the first is going to be the vacancy repository. We create a vacancy repository, which is going to be underscore vacancy repository, right? And then we also need underscore page, which is going to be 1, and then the limit of the number of items that we are going to get per page. So we are going to be retrieving like 10 job vacancies at a time, right? And then we also need the current page. So the current page, we are going to initialize it at 0. And then we also need list of type vacancy model that we are going to use to store vacancies, right? And then we are just going to call it all data. It's going to be like an empty array, right? And then now here, what we are going to do is we need to initialize the vacancy repository, which is called to reference.watch. So now we need to just make sure that we watch the vacancy repository provider. So I think we forgot to create it. So let's go back inside our repository vacancy repository, and then here what we're simply going to do is let's create a provider, vacancy repository provider. Then let's make sure that we import Flutter Riverpod so that we can use the provider class, right? Okay, now that we are done. Now for the client, we are simply going to simply watch reference.watch the HTTP provider that we created in the previous videos, right? Okay, now that we're done, let's go back to our vacancy controller, and then we can simply watch vacancy repository provider right here, right? And then now what we are simply going to do is, so what's going to happen is that when this vacancy controller class is called, right, the first method that's going to be called is this build function right here, initial the build function. So now this makes it very easy for us to initialize like initial data, right, if we're getting from an API, right? So come back and take care of initializing the data. Now let's just go back. Let's just go and take care of the vacancies, right? So the first method that we need is to retrieve the vacancies from our API, right? Then let's make sure that we have the required parameter, which is going to be page, right? So at first, now we need to get the response, which we are going to await. We're going to get it from our vacancy repository. And then let's just make sure that put the limit, which is going to be like 10 items, right? We are going to retrieve 10 items at a time, right? And then let's just return a switch statement. So if there's an error, we'll simply throw that, right? Okay, so simply now, this is the method for simply getting all the job vacancies from our API, right? So the first thing that we need is we need the required integer parameter, which is the page, right? In this case, we set the initialized page, which is going to be equal to what is going to be equal to 1, right? So here we just put it to page. So we can even put like another page, maybe 2, and then the limit is going to be 10, which we initialized there, which is going to be 10. And then since we used future either from our vacancy repository, if you still remember, yeah, getting vacancies, we use the either, right? So what basically this does is allows us to just create a switch statement on our response here, and then we'll make sure that if on the left side, that means that if we get the error, if we still remember, we just throw the error, and then if we get success, we'll just return our vacancies, right? So now let's create another method for retrieving the first page from our API, right? So this is going to be our future, and then with the pagination state, and then we're simply going to fetch the first page, right? So here we are simply, at first we are going to set the current page equal to 1, since we are getting the first page. So now we are changing this variable to set the current page to be equal to 1, right? And then first what we are simply doing is we'll simply clear all the data that is stored in our array, right? We want to clear it first, right? And then what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to get our vacancies, right? And then we are simply going to await these vacancies from the get vacancies method, and then we are going to set it to current page. Since we want to retrieve the first page, right, we'll set it to the current page, which is going to be 1, right? And then the next thing that we have to do now is for our all data variable that we are going to store a list of our vacancies, we are simply going to set it to a list, and this list is just going to come from our vacancies, right? So our vacancies from the first page, right? And then after this, what we simply need to do now is we simply need to return now the pagination state that is updated, right? And then for the data, we'll simply set this data to our We'll simply set this data to our vacancies, to our all data vacancies list that we have updated here. So we'll simply set this updated data right here, right? And then now what we simply need to do is loading is set it to false, right? Since we already have all the vacancies that we got, so there's no need for us to load, right? And then we are simply going to check if there are any more vacancies, right? So to check if there are any more vacancies, we'll simply use the vacancies dot length. We are simply going to check. We are simply going to check if the vacancies that we are getting from our API is equal to our limit, which is 10, right? So we're saying that we are getting 10 vacancies at a time, right? So if it's more than that, means that this boolean will be true. So that means that we will have more vacancies. If it's less than, it will be false. That means we no longer have any vacancies, right? And then now we need to set the current page now for our state. The current page now will now be equal to our current page, which is the first page, right? So now we have taken care of this now, and then if somehow we have an error, right? If somehow we have an error, so what we simply have to do is we'll simply set the error state to be equal to pagination state, right? And then for our data, we're simply going to pass our data that we stored inside our array, right? And then we'll simply set the error to e.toString, right? And then we're also going to set the current page also to our current page. And then the next thing that we need to do is we'll just now update our state, which is going, since our state, if we have an error, we are simply going to update our state to be equal to async error. And then here we'll simply pass in e, and then here we'll simply pass in stack trace.current. Okay, then we'll simply return what the error state. And then we'll simply return the error state, right? So one good thing about the AsyncNotifier, right? Since it allows us to get data. Since it allows us to get data from an API, we use it to get data from an API to manage state that is asynchronous, right? That means that state that is asynchronous, for example, getting data from our API, our state is going to be asynchronous, right? The good thing about the AsyncNotifier is that it has another class that is called the async value, right? So this async value, it has three states, right? It has the async data that we can use to manipulate the data that we get from our API. It has the async loading that we can use to set the state of our AsyncNotifier to loading if the data is still loading. And then also the async error that we can use also to handle errors, right? Like what we did here, as you can see here. Like what we did here, you can see when we're handling the error here, we use the async error class, right? We use the async error class to simply update our state to async error, and then we pass in the error and then the stack trace, right? That's the nice thing about using the AsyncNotifier class, right? So now the next thing that we need to do now is also to refresh, right? To refresh our data, right? So we are simply going to create a function to refresh our data, right? I'm going to just name refresh, right? First, we need to just set the current state of this refresh to state.value for now, right? So this means that the state it returns the state of it returns the value or a previous value. That means that if in loading or in error state. So if there are no values, it will just set this current state to now, right? And then now what we are simply going to do is we are simply going to check if the current state is not equal to null. So if the current state is not equal to null, that means that we have data from that we got from our API, right? And then we'll simply update our state to async data, right? As you can see now, we are using the async data. We are now using the async data class. As you can see, this one, it creates it creates an async value with the data, right? And then what we are simply going to do here is we are simply going to now update the current state. So simply going to update the current state, and then we'll just set is loading is equals to true. So which means that if the current state is not equal to now, that means that we have data that's still coming from our API. So that's why we are using is loading. We're setting is loading is equal to true, all right? And then else here, we now have an else. So else, that means that the current state is not equal to null. So that means that we have the data. We are simply going to set our state to async loading, right? So that means that we are still loading the items from our API, right? Now what we simply need to do now is to create a try catch block. So in our current try catch block, we'll set the current page is equals to 1. Since we are refreshing our data, right? For example, we want that if the user pulls the refresh indicator, we want it to load the items, right? We'll set the current page to 1, right? And then if there was previous data inside our list of vacancies, we are simply going to clear that data, right? And then what we are simply going to do now is we are simply getting new vacancies, right, from our API. And then we'll then set the page to the current page, right, like this. And then now we'll then update our list now, right? So we'll then update our list to the new vacancies that we got from our API, right? And then we'll then update our state, right? So now the new state is goes to Pagination State, right? And then our data is going to be our vacancies that we got. And then is loading, we are going to set is loading to false. And then we are going to check if we still have items from our API. So make sure that the vacancies.length compare it to the limit. So that means that if we have more 10 items on page 1, that means that we still have more vacancies, right? That means that has next will be true. If not, has next will be false, right? And then we then set the current page to a current page, which is 1, right? And then now we then update the state. We now update the state using the async data, and then we'll then set it to new state, right? Like this. Right, now it's time for us to handle any errors, right? So basically what we are simply going to do here is we are simply going to say it's going to be error, and then let's also provide the state trace, right? And then what we're simply going to do is set the state to async error. And then we'll just put in the error and then the state trace right here, right? And then now we have another model, right? Since if we go back to our vacancies here to get vacancies method, you can see that we are getting vacancies from our API, right? And then we have already put the limit to 10 items, right? But what if we want more items? That means that if the user scrolls up to those 10 items, we don't have a way of getting more items, right? Besides those first 10 items. So we need a way of making sure that we get more items from our API. So that means we want to get vacancies from 11 going downwards, right? So let's go back. Let's create another method below, right? So let's create a method that is going to just load more vacancies from our API. Let's just name it load more. It's an async function as well. So now in this method, what we are simply going to do is we are going to check if the state, right, dot value dot is loading more is equal to true, or if the state dot value dot has next is equals to false. And then we are simply just going to just return function. So basically what we are doing here is we are going to check if we are going to check this boolean if is loading more is equals to true. That means that if we still have more items, or if as next is equals to false, that means that if we don't have more items from our API, that means that we have exhausted all the job vacancies from our API. If in that case, we are simply going to return, and then we are simply going to exit this if statement, right? And then now what we need to do here is we need to set the state. So the state in this case is going to be the async data, right? And then what we are simply going to do is we need to update the value. So now with AsyncNotifier, it's more of like the state is immutable, right? You cannot manipulate the state directly, so you have to use the copy with function, right, to copy more items to update our state, right? So dot value and then dot copy with, and then we are going to set its loading is equal to true. So that means that we still have more items from our API. So we need to update this state to what, to show that its loading is equal to true, so that we can, if we have a circular progress indicator, it will keep on loading, right? And then we also need to update the page, right? Next page. So next page is just equal to page, which is 1. And then we are simply going to add another page, right? And then now what we need to do is we need to get new vacancies, right, from our API. All right, so now this is our loading function, right? So the first step that we do inside our load more function is we are going to check if is loading more is equal to true, right? If we are still loading more items from our database, we are going to check if it's equal to true, or we are going to check if as next is equal to false, right? That means that if we don't have any items from our API, and then we are simply going to return this function, and then we are going to exit this if statement, right? And then at first, now we need, since we are getting new vacancies from our API, we need to set our async data. We need to update the state, right, to make sure that is loading is equals to true. Since we haven't gotten the data, we are still getting it, is loading is equals to true. And then after that, we create a variable for the next page, right, which we are just going to implement our current page, and then we are going to add +1 to our current page, right? And then we are going to get new vacancies, right, from our API. And then from these new vacancies, we are going to set what the page we are going to update it to the next, using the next page here that we created here. And then we are going to check if from our new vacancies, if our new vacancy is not equal to empty, right, that means that we still have more vacancies. If we still have more vacancies, that means that we would then set our page to our next page, right? And then after that, we'll simply update the state, right? And then we'll make sure that we'll update the state, and then we'll make sure that with the data that we have, right, if we had the first 10 vacancies that we got, right, we are going to add another we are going to add another vacancies that we are getting new vacancies from the ones that we already had, right? And then we are going to set is loading is equals to false, and then we are going to check using the has next boolean function if the new vacancies dot length is equals to the limit. That means that has next is equal to false. If it's greater than the limit, that means that we still have more items, right? So that's it. That's the function for loading more items, right? So now we are simply going to take care of the getting vacancies by category, right? So to get vacancies by category, what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to copy our get vacancies method, and then below this, I'm simply going to paste it, and then I'm simply going to change the get vacancies by category, right? And then we just change this required parameter to string category ID, right? And then here, what we're simply going to do is let's change this method to get vacancies by category, and then now we are done with this. And then we also need to get the vacancy by ID, right? So we are simply going to do the same thing. I'm simply going to paste it here, and then I'm just going to change this from list to vacancy module, and then I'm just going to rename it to get vacancy by ID. And then I'm simply going to string ID. And then we are simply going to change this method right here to get vacancy by ID, right? And then we need to get rid of this bracket right here, and then we simply need to pass in the ID, right? And then we have to do the same thing for searching vacancies, right? So I'm simply going to paste it here, and then I'm simply going to change it to search vacancies. Right, and then set string to search. And then what you're simply going to do is search vacancies, and then paste in the search right there, right? So now we've taken care of the vacancy controller. Now it's time for us to create the providers, right? So the first provider that we are going to create is the vacancy controller provider. You are going to set to async notifier, async notifier provider, right? Then it's going to check in the vacancy controller, and then pagination state. Right, now we need the feature provider for getting vacancies, right? Just going to call it get vacancies provider, right? Which is going to be a feature provider. then when set vacancies, so we're simply going to watch the vacancy controller, and we just use the notifier object, right? And then we'll just have to return vacancies dot get vacancies, right? And then we'll set the page to the first page, right? Since when we get the vacancies, we want to get, at first we want to get the vacancies from the first page, right? And then now what we need to do now is to take care of search vacancies provider, right? So at first we need to create a search query, right? So we'll create a search query provider, which we are just going to use to update the what? To update the search query, right? So it's going to be a state provider of type string. So we want to update the string, right? So initially we want to set this string to be empty. So let's just set it to empty, right? We want to set this string to be empty, right? And then let's create provider for, which is we're going to create core search vacancies provider. Which is going to be a future provider. Then it's going to be a type of list, since we are getting a list of vacancies, right? A vacancy model. So at first we need to create a variable that we're going to use to get like that we are going to use to watch the vacancy. So here I made a mistake. It's supposed to be in reference and then async. And then let's create a variable that we are going to use to watch the vacancy controller. So we just name it vacancies. Just go to reference the watch, and then vacancy controller provider notifier. Right, and then now what we simply have to do is we need to create another variable for our query, which we are just going to watch the changes to our search query provider, right? To our search query provider, right? And then at first we want to check if this query is empty, right? So that means that the user didn't enter anything, right? So I want to check if query is empty. So if the query is empty, then we are simply just going to what? To display the normal vacancies, right? We are just going to display the normal vacancies. So if the query is not empty, that means that the user has typed something, right? Then we want to what? To search the vacancies, right? A way to search vacancies, right? So we are getting, oh, okay, we used angle brackets instead of curly brackets, right? Then we'll simply what? We'll simply search what? We'll simply search our API, right? So provider here, it's supposed to be provider. Let's get rid of this. Yeah. saying that query isn't defined. Okay, just set it to the query, right? And then we also need a feature provider to get vacancy by ID, right? So say get vacancy by ID provider, which is going to be feature provider. Is going to be feature provider dot family. So we use the family if we want to put arguments right inside our provider, right? So the arguments is, we have the first argument, which is reference, which we are going to use to watch providers, and then we also have another one, which is ID, right? First, we simply need to create a variable vacancies to watch our vacancy control, right? Controller provider.notifier, right? And then we'll simply return vacancies.get vacancy by ID, right? Simply use this one, get vacancy by ID, right? And then we also have to get the vacancy by category ID, right? So what I'll simply do is I'll simply copy this get vacancies provider, copy this one, and then I'll paste it below the get vacancy by ID. Then we are going to get vacancies by category. Get vacancies by category provider, right? And then supposed to use the family. And then here, simply pass the argument, which is going to be category ID, right? And then we'll make sure that we just get vacancies by category ID, which we set it, which we just input the category ID as our argument, right? So now that we are done with the vacancies controller, now let's go. It's time for us to implement our user interface, right? It's time for us to display these vacancies right here, right on our home screen, right? So now let's just go to our user interface and start implementing it. So now we are working on our user interface, as you can see. So this is going to be our user interface right here. As you can see, we have this nice card here with the job title and then the salary, and then we have these job tags which are going to take off, and then we have the company, right? So now let's start. Let's go to our widgets, right? Inside vacancies and then widgets. Let's create a vacancy item widget, right? So basically what we are simply going to do is it's going to be like a stateless widget, right? So it's going to be a vacancy item widget, vacancy item widget. So we are going to change in order for us to consume providers in our user interface, we need to change this from stateless widget to consumer widget. And then we need to modify our build function, right, to include widget reference. So this widget reference will allow us to read or watch providers, right, to consume providers, right? So now that we are done, the first thing that we need to do is, in this case, what we are simply going to do is we are not to consume other providers later, but in this case, what we simply need to do is the vacancy model. We need to create the vacancy, to initialize the vacancy model, right? Which is going to be vacancy model. And then we are simply going to pass it inside our constructor, right? As a required parameter. So vacancy model right? And then what we're simply going to do here is we are going to return a card. Right, we are simply going to return a card. So we need to import material that card, and then the elevation is going to be 5, right? And then we need the color. It's going to be white. Right, now what we need to do is we need to create a size box, right? Child, which is going to be a size box, right? So basically we don't need the size box, we just need a column widget. And then we need to set the main axis alignment to main axis alignment dot start. Same with the cross axis alignment to cross axis alignment dot start. Right, so now that we are done, now we need the children property, right? And then we need to display a text, right? So the text is going to be vacancy model dot title dot toString, right? And then just need to apply some text style. And then let's set the font size to 20. And then color to black. Font weight W700, right? And then after this, we need some spacing between our text, so we're simply going to use the size box. So we're simply going to set that size box, the height, we're simply going to give it a height of 10. Right. And then we don't want this, our text to be close to the wall, so I'm just going to wrap it with a padding widget, right? And then after this, also need another text. In this case, this text is going to be our vacancy. It's going to be select.toString. And then also we need the text style property, right? So let me just copy it and let's paste it. So we need to change the text style. We need to change the font to 15. And then font weight to 300, right? Then so need some spacing again. Size box. The height is going to be 10, right? And then also we need to wrap our text with a padding widget, right? So now we need a row widget, right? As you can see here, we have this item. We need a row widget, right? For what? So first we need a vacancy list text, right? We need the vacancy list text, as you can see. So now let's go inside our let's go. So let's rename this to widgets. It's supposed to be widgets. So let's just rename it to widgets. And then let's create another widget, which I'm simply going to name vacancy text. Vacancy text widget. Got that right. So it's going to be a stateless widget. and then vacancy text widget, right? So I'm going to check in. Let's create string parameter. Let's pass it inside our constructor, right? Require this dot check, right? Then let's just remove these constants since our widget is dynamic, right? Now what we simply need to do here is we are simply going to return padding widget. Simply pass page insets.o, and then the value is going to be true, and then the child is going to be a chip. I'm going to pass in a chip, and then we need to set the background color. So the background color is going to be white, right? Then we need to the label, just passing the text widget, then passing the tag, then passing the tag, and then for the style you simply have to pass in. So this is the style, and then we need to just style our, and then we'll give it a color of black. Okay, so now that we are done with the vacancy tags widget, right? Okay, so let's rename this capital as a T, right? So now we need to create another widget which we are going to call tags vacancy text list vacancy tag list widget. So vacancy tag list widget. Then simply have here, what you simply have to do is vacancy model, vacancy model, and then vacancy model, and then simply pass it inside of construct. Right, vacancy model, and then what we simply need to do here, simply return a size box. Simply return size box. We can give it a height of 50. We give it a height of 50, and then after that, what we are simply going to do is we need a child widget, which is going to be a list view dot builder, right? And then we are going to set the shrink wrap to true. And then the score direction is going to be axis.horizontal, right? And then here we'll simply pass in the context and then index argument, right? And also we need item count. If you don't put the item count, you get an error, right? So the item count is going to be vacancy model dot text dot length, right? And then here what we simply have to do is simply return our vacancy item widget, and then so we simply return our vacancy text widget, right? And then for the text we just simply input what the vacancy model dot skill text, right? Vacancy model dot text, then what, index, right? And then index. So this can be now, right? So we are done with the vacancy we are done with the vacancy list. So inside our vacancy item here, simply have to return the vacancy text list widget, right? The vacancy text list widget, and then now we have to take care of the company. Now we have to take care of the company data, right? If we go to our app, you can see we have this company data with company logo and then company name, right? So let's do it. So it's going to be a raw widget, children. Then we want to separate the items, so we use main and axis alignment. So main axis alignment dot space between, right? So inside the children, what we need is we need to first check, right? We need to first check if vacancy model dot company, right, which can be now dot logo, the company logo. If that logo is not equal to null, right? If that logo is not equal to null, simply display a circle avatar, right? And then we simply display a circle avatar, and then the background color will be colors.white. Colors.white, and then the radius will be 30. And then the background image will be a network image, right? Network image, which will set to vacancy dot company dot logo. Else we are simply going to set it to, that means that we don't have the company logo. What we simply have to do now is we'll simply have to set a default image from our asset folder. So let's just copy this circle avatar right here. Copy this circle avatar right here. Let's paste it below. Paste it below, and here set it to the asset image, background image. We'll set it to asset image. Then inside our asset image right here, we are simply going to set it to assets /images, and then we'll just set it to person.png, right, like this. Right, so now that we are done with this, what we simply have to do now is need to display also the company name, right? So we'll simply display a text, which is going to be vacancy model dot company dot name dot toString. toString, right? And then we simply have to set the style to text. And then the font size we'll set it to 20, and then the font weight will be font weight to W600, right? And then we need also to set the color. So the color is going to be black. Right. So now we are done with this vacancy item widget, right? So now this whole item, we don't want it to touch the wall, so we just wrap it to the padding widget, right? So now what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to create a vacancy list widget, right? Vacancy list widget. To be a stateless widget, vacancy list widget. So here, what we need to change this to consumer widget, so that we can consume Riverpod providers, right? Then now we need to modify our build context. Just pass in the widget reference property, which will allow us to just read or watch providers, right? And then now we'll just create, just watch the vacancies provider, which is go to reference dot watch get vacancies provider, right there, right? So now we're simply going to return vacancies. And then we're simply going to use the when property. So this property gives us properties that we can use to handle data. We use the data when we get the data from our API, error for error handling, and loading to load the data. That's a nice thing about Riverpod. So just say vacancies. Then we'll just return a list builder right here. A list builder. A list view, sorry. Just return a list view dot builder. Right, and then what we need is set the physics. So the physics is going to be never scrollable physics. And then we also need to set the item count, right? So the item count is going to be vacancies dot length, right? And then you want also to set shrimp rep to be equal to true. All right, and then also need to set also the item count. So okay, we have taken care of the item count, right? So now let's take care of the item builder, right? So for item builder, it takes in two arguments, which is the context, then index property. Right, so now we'll simply return, what we're simply going to return is a vacancy item widget, which we are going to just pass the vacancies and then pass in the index. All right. Then here to handle errors, we'll simply pass in error property and stack trace. Then we'll simply display an error text with error.toString. then for the loading, we'll simply show a circular progress indicator. So load a circular progress indicator like this. Right, now that we are done with the vacancy, let's go now to our home screen. Right, so let's go to our home screen. So home screen. So let's check. So after this home screen, what we simply need to do is we simply need to take care of a few things. So below our job categories widget, we'll simply create a raw widget with children, and then we have a text with let's just call them vacancies, and then we just give the text type property, and then the color colors job black, font size, then font size is going to be 20. It's going to be font weight .w600. .w600, right? And then we also need another text, right? So we just copy this, then I'll just paste it below. So I'll just copy this text widget right here, and then I'll just paste it below. Then I'll change it to CO. Let's change the font size to 14. Then the font weight to W300, right? So now after this widget, so now we need to wrap this widget with a padding widget. And then after this, simply have to display a vacancies list widget right there, right? So now that we're done displaying the vacancies list widget, let's just refresh our application, and then let's see. So I say now value use on a now. Okay, so something is wrong with our, so here, also here, the widgets, there must be space between those two widgets. So let's go inside our, and then we want main axis alignment dot space between. Space between. All right, so basically what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open our Postman. So we made a mistake on the tag. It's supposed to be skill tags, not tag, right? So let's go inside our vacancy model. Let's go inside our vacancy model right here, right? So let's change it to from tags to skill tags. Right, and then let's run that build runner, delete conflicting outputs, right? Okay, now that we are done, I think we are going to get a few errors in the skill tags. a skill text widget, and then check on the, I think it's going to be skill text list, right? It's supposed to be skill text, right? And then let's change it to skill text. Okay, I think now we are. So let's just refresh and see if now our application is working. Yeah, now you can see now we are getting these vacancies right there, right? We are now getting those vacancies right there, and then you can see they are even limited to 10 vacancies, right? So in the next video, we are going to be displaying all vacancies and then also implementing pagination, right? So if you enjoyed this video, just make sure you click thumbs up and then make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. Thanks for watching, guys. Cheers.